The city was always quietest after midnight, but for Wang Yibo, that was when the world felt most alive. He sat in a dim studio, neon lights casting a glow of a control board, headphones snug against his ears. His voice, calm yet magnetic, drifted across the airwaves. Good evening, everyone. This is Midnight Radio, and I'm your host, Yibo. Tonight, like every night, I'll be your company until dawn. Call in, share your story, or just listen. Sometimes silence is a language, too. His words wrapped around the listeners like a warm blanket. He had built a reputation as a mysterious late-night DJ whose voice soothed insomniacs, students burning midnight oil, and lonely souls needing company. For Yibo, it wasn't just about music. It was about listening. Every night, he waited for stories that touched him. And then there was him. It started one rainy night. A caller who introduced himself simply as Zhan Zhan had phoned in. His voice was deep, gentle, yet laced with something fragile. "I couldn't sleep," he confessed softly. "I heard your voice, and it felt like maybe I could talk." Yibo had leaned closer to the microphone. His curiosity piqued. "That's what I'm here for. Tell me whatever you want." Zhan Zhan didn't share much that first night. Just fragment about being an artist who loved painting, but had lost the inspiration to create. He laughed nervously, as if embarrassed. Yibo remembered smiling into the silence, reassured by how genuine the man sounded. "Maybe inspiration isn't gone," Yibo told him. "Maybe it's waiting in the dark, like you. You just have to let it walk back to you." The line had gone quiet for a second before Zhan Zhan whispered, "Thank you. That was the beginning." Night after night, Zhan Zhan called in. Sometimes it was at the start of the show. Other times it was near closing, when the sky was paling with dawn. He never revealed much about who he was, but Yibo grew accustomed to his voice, the cadence of his laughter, the pauses that carried more weight than words. Zhan Zhan talked about his struggles with loneliness, about feeling like he was searching for something he couldn't name. Yibo found himself waiting for those calls, his chest tightening with a strange anticipation whenever the studio phone lit up. "Do you believe that two strangers can understand each other just by talking?" Zhan Zhan asked one night. Yibo paused, eyes fixed on the blinking light of the switchboard. "I do," he said simply. "Sometimes strangers hear us better than anyone else." The silence on the other end was tender, almost intimate. Then came Zhan Zhan's reply, quiet and steady. "Then I'm glad you hear me." Yibo couldn't explain it, but something in that statement lodged deep in him. Weeks passed, and Zhan Zhan became more than just a caller. Listeners began to notice, too. They sent messages asking about the mysterious painter who calls in, fascinated by the connection between the DJ and his regular guest. Yibo never admitted how much those late-night conversations had begun to anchor him. By day, he was quiet, withdrawn, his colleagues often commenting that he lived in his own world. But by night, with Zhan Zhan's voice in his ear, he felt awake in a way he never did under the sun. Once, during a lull in their conversation, Yibo asked, "Why do you always call me at night?" Zhan Zhan chuckled, low and husky, "Because night feels safer. In the day, everything is loud, rushed, and demanding. But at night, I can be honest. I can be me." "Then who are you during the day?" Yibo pressed gently. There was a long pause. "Someone I don't always recognize." Yibo leaned back in his chair, heart tightening. He didn't know the details, but he wanted to. He wanted to strip away whatever mask Zhan Zhan wore during daylight, to see the man who spoke so sincerely in the shadows. One night, when the air felt heavy with summer rain, Zhan Zhan said something that unsettled Yibo in the best way. "Sometimes, when you're talking on the radio, I close my eyes and pretend you're sitting across from me. It makes the world less lonely." Yibo's throat went dry. He forced a smile into his voice. "Careful, Zhan Zhan. If you say things like that, I might believe you're real." The laugh that came through the line was both teasing and vulnerable. Maybe that's the point. From then on, Yibo carried Zhan Zhan with him everywhere, his voice echoing his thoughts during grocery runs, his words lingering while he wrote playlists, his presence so vivid it felt tangible. It scared him, how much he depended on a man he'd never seen. Yet it also comforted him. Months passed, and the bond deepened. Zhan Zhan started sharing more. How he struggled with expectations. How fame had turned parts of his life into something unrecognizable. How he sometimes wished he could vanish into obscurity. Yibo never pressed for details, but small clues slipped through. Mentions of crowded schedules, the exhaustion of being under constant scrutiny, the ache of performing happiness when he wasn't always sure he felt it. One night, Yibo asked softly, "Do you ever wish you could tell people who you really are?" Zhan Zhan exhaled. "Every day. But it's easier to hide. At least with you, I don't have to pretend." Yibo swallowed the lump in his throat. "Then don't pretend. Not here. Not with me." The silence that followed felt like a vow. But as much as Yibo cherished their late-night talks, he couldn't ignore the question gnawing at him. Who was Zhan Zhan, really? The answer came unexpectedly. It was a weekend afternoon when Yibo, scrolling absently through social media, stumbled upon a video clip. A famous actor was on stage, smiling for fans, his laughter filling the screen. But it wasn't the smile that froze Yibo's hand mid-scroll. It was the voice, that deep, gentle cadence he'd memorized over countless nights. Xiao Zhan. The name struck like lightning. He was a beloved actor, adored by millions, constantly in the spotlight. Yet behind the polished image was the same man who whispered confessions into Yibo's headphones after midnight. Zhan Zhan wasn't just a lonely artist. He was a Xiao Zhan, hiding his truest self in the anonymity of late-night radio calls. Yibo sat frozen, headphones hanging around his neck, heart pounding. Suddenly, everything made sense. The guarded words, the hints about fame, the ache of living a double life. He should have felt betrayed, but instead, he felt something deeper, awe, tenderness, and a pull stronger than ever. That night, when the phone line blinked and Zhan Zhan's familiar voice filled the studio, Yibo listened differently. He heard not just a caller, but a man carrying the weight of the world, finding solace in the dark. "Rough day?" Yibo asked, his tone gentler than usual. Zhan Zhan chuckled faintly. "You could say that, but hearing you makes it better." Yibo closed his eyes, steadying himself. "Do you ever think about what would happen if the world knew who you were when you called me?" There was silence, then a careful reply. "Do you already know?" Yibo's breath caught. He hadn't meant to reveal anything, but perhaps the intimacy between them left no room for secrets. "I do," he admitted quietly. "And it doesn't change anything. You're still the person who tells me about your fears, your dreams, your truth. That's who I care about." For the first time, Zhan Zhan's voice trembled. "You have no idea how much that means to me." The studio always carried a hush at night, a kind of sacred silence broken only by the low hum of the equipment. Yibo had grown used to the rhythm of solitude, the red, on-air sign glowing, the scratch of vinyl under his fingertips, the gentle exhale of his voice drifting into the unseen lives of strangers. Yet since Zhan Zhan's first call, that solitude had shifted into something else. Expectation. Every night, Yibo found himself waiting, eyes lingering on the switchboard as if willing the blinking light to appear. One evening, a storm was raging outside, lightning slicing across the windows. Yibo cued a slow jazz piece, leaning back in his chair, when the phone line lit up. His lips curved unconsciously. Midnight radio. This is Yibo. There was the faintest crackle before the familiar voice filled his ears. "It's me again." Yibo let out a small laugh, his shoulders easing. "You never need to introduce yourself. I'd know your voice anywhere." Zhan Zhan chuckled, soft but tinged with surprise. "Is that so? What if one day I stopped calling? Would you still remember?" Yibo's gaze lingered on the rain, racing down the glass. "I'd remember. Some voices stay, even in silence." The line went quiet, but not uncomfortably so. Yibo had grown to love those pauses. The spaces where he imagined Zhan Zhan's thoughts, the curve of his lips, the rise and fall of his chest. It was in those silences that intimacy bloomed, unspoken but undeniable. "Today I tried to paint again," Zhan Zhan said finally, "but the canvas looked at me like a stranger. I hated it." "Maybe you're looking at it too hard," Yibo suggested. "Sometimes inspiration comes when you're not searching, like a song you didn't expect to hear, but suddenly it fits your mood perfectly." Like hearing your voice at midnight. Yibo's pulse skipped. He tried to keep his tone steady, playful even, something like that. The storm outside cracked loudly, but neither of them flinched. They were cocooned in their own small world, stitched together by electricity, airwaves, and a bond no one else could see. Other nights brought different stories. Once, Zhan Zhan confessed he had walked the city streets in disguise just to feel ordinary. I bought dumplings from a street vendor. No one recognized me. For the first time in months, I wasn't an image or a name. I was just someone hungry, eating by the roadside. Yibo smiled, picturing it vividly. That sounds perfect. Simple. Real. It was, Zhan Zhan agreed. But then I thought about how fleeting it was. Tomorrow, I'd wake up and with a mask again. And the loneliness, it came back heavier. Yibo's chest tightened. He wished he could reach through the line, pull the man into the quiet safety of the studio, and tell him he didn't have to wear any masks here. Instead, he said softly, "If it gets heavy again, call me, even if it's just to tell me about dumplings." The laugh that followed was warm, grateful, and Yibo clung to it. Their conversations became rituals. Yibo learned that Zhan Zhan loved old movies, the kind where black and white flickered like memories. He adored cats, though he couldn't keep one. He sometimes wrote poetry in the margins of his notebooks, but never showed anyone. Each detail was like a breadcrumb leading Yibo closer, though the mystery of his true self still lingered. But there were moments when the mystery turned into tension. One night, the call came later than usual. Yibo had almost given up, disappointment gnawing at him. When finally the line lit, he answered quickly, trying to sound casual. "You kept me waiting tonight." Zhan Zhan's voice was weary, edges roughened. "I almost didn't call. The day was too much." "What happened?" Yibo asked, tone gentle. A long silence stretched. Then, a broken whisper, "Sometimes it feels like I belong to everyone but myself. Do you know what that's like?" Yibo's hand clenched into a fist on the desk. "Maybe I don't, but I know what it's like to want something real. And when you call me, that's real." The words slipped out before he could stop them. On the other end, Zhan Zhan drew a sharp breath, as though caught off guard by the raw honesty. "Real," he echoed. "Yes, with you it feels that way." Yibo closed his eyes, his heart pounding too loudly in the silence. For the rest of the night, neither of them said much, but the weight of unspoken feelings lingered, threading through the music that filled the gaps. As weeks bled into months, their calls began to blur into something neither wanted to name, but both felt deeply. Sometimes, Yibo wondered if it was dangerous to fall for a voice, for a stranger wrapped in secrecy. Yet every time he heard Zhan Zhan laugh, every time his words trembled with sincerity, Yibo knew it was too late. One night, when the city outside was hushed under falling snow, Zhan Zhan asked, "Do you ever imagine what I look like?" Yibo smirked faintly, leaning into the microphone. "Sometimes. But mostly, I imagine what it feels like when you smile." There was a startled pause, followed by a breathless laugh. "You shouldn't say things like that. You'll make me want to show you." The words hung between them, fragile and daring, a promise neither had yet the courage to keep. From then on, Yibo found himself daydreaming during the quiet hours of daylight, wondering what kind of man hid behind the voice, what kind of eyes held that loneliness, what kind of smile carried both warmth and sorrow. He didn't know his name, not yet, but he knew his essence, and that was enough to make the world feel less empty. Every time the red on-air sign glowed, Yibo's chest stirred with anticipation, not for the countless strangers tuned in, but for one caller who would turn the midnight hours into something sacred. A caller whose hidden identity didn't matter as much as the truth they shared in whispers, laughter, and silences. What started as radio had become something far greater, a lifeline, a secret sanctuary, a story only the night could hold. And though Yibo didn't yet know the face behind the voice, he knew this. He was no longer alone in the dark.